Hello, welcome to the Duty to Warn vidcast. I'd like to welcome my guest, Leonard Glass. Dr. Glass is an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, a senior attending psychiatrist at McLean Hospital. He is past president of the Boston Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, and up until April 7th, 2017, he was a distinguished life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. Now, my understanding is that usually when someone's a life fellow, they're a fellow for life. So could you tell us the story of what happened on April 7th, 2017?
Sure. Well, I have to start you with a bit of the background, and thanks for that introduction, John. So in February, a group of us wrote a letter to the New York Times criticizing the Goldwater Rule. I'm not sure how much background on the Goldwater Rule is needed here. What would you say?
I think most of our listeners are familiar with it.
Okay. So we decried the fact that the Goldwater Rule seemed to be inhibiting mental health professionals from speaking out about obvious dangers and liabilities in the presidency of Donald Trump. And about a month later, and possibly in reaction to that letter, the American Psychiatric Association, the authors of the Goldwater Rule, essentially doubled down on the Goldwater Rule, saying that it wasn't just that one couldn't diagnose someone who one hadn't examined and gotten authorization to speak about, but one couldn't make any comment whatsoever about a public figure and identify oneself as a psychiatrist. Well, since I was committed to speaking out and to continuing to write and publish on the issue of Donald Trump's dangerousness, I felt this was an unacceptable infringement on my right as a citizen and as a professional to add to the dialogue in the public square, to come to some greater understanding of the extraordinary situation we found ourselves in. So I contacted the president of the American Psychiatric Association and told her that unless they rescinded this rule, that I would resign my membership and my distinguished life fellowship, etc., after 41 years of participation. She connected me with a member of the ethics committee of the American Psychiatric, somebody who I happen to know and respect. And we had a telephone dialogue, and we came to an understanding between the two of us that it was morally respectworthy to refrain from commenting if one felt that that would be improper, but that it was also morally respectworthy to comment about Mr. Trump's psychological functioning as long as one acknowledged the limitations of one's methodology, i.e. that you hadn't directly examined him and the like. That seemed to me to be quite appropriate, and I was willing to do that. And I'd have been happy if the American Psychiatric Association had just said, be cautious when you make these comments because you haven't had direct access to the individual, and you need to acknowledge those limitations. But they didn't. And when we came to the end of our consultation, the ethics committee representative and myself, we both agreed that while it was morally respectworthy to comment in that fashion, one would be in violation of the Code of Ethics of the American Psychiatric Association if one did so. And so, as someone who has taught ethics and published professionally about ethics, I was faced with a choice of either being constrained by a gag rule of the American Psychiatric Association or being allowed to express my conscience, but then to do so under the cloud of ethical suspicion from the American Psychiatric Association. Well, that was an unacceptable place to be, and so I resigned, regretfully, but I felt they gave me no choice.
Right. So tell us what you think is wrong about the Goldwater Rule, and also maybe a little bit of insight, I'm particularly interested in this, as to what you think the APA's real motivation is. You know, you had said the other day when we spoke that it's not like the Goldwater Rule came down from Mount Sinai on tablets. You know, we had to, this is not like the most sacred principle of psychiatry. It was kind of a cover your ass move after a lawsuit. I think we do have to keep that historical context in mind.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And I think if one understands the sense of vulnerability and exposure that mental health professionals in general may feel about whether their professional work is viewed as scientific and respect-worthy, one can understand a kind of sense of guild vulnerability and the need to protect the guild from the good-natured belittling that one experiences in the New Yorker's cartoons and the more harsh, dismissive, and acid criticisms that come from other quarters.
Yeah.
But that, first of all, that's rooted in a historical insecurity on the part of psychiatry and the other mental health professions. And it's also, when push comes to shove, one is either protecting the public image of psychiatry with a capital P, or one is allowing one's fully trained, mature, responsible, vetted professionals to express themselves guided by their own judgment, professionalism, and specifically their knowledge of the way that their own feelings and biases could influence statements. That's the way an association that respected its members and trusted them to use good judgment and didn't privilege its public relations image over their conscience promptings, that's the way they would behave. That is not the way APA has responded.
Well, I'm really glad to hear you put it that way, and I agree with you that we're talking about, we agree with each other, of course.
We do.
That's why I'm interviewing you. But I appreciate the way you articulated it and called a spade, because very few people have come out and said this. Even those who have disagreed with the Goldwater Rule, very few people have taken the next step of analyzing where the American Psychiatric Association is coming from in terms of their motivations. And I happen to agree with you that it is a forced choice here between guild protection or public image protection and protection of the public.
Right. Well, the protection of the public could be significantly enhanced by the addition of psychiatric expertise to a confusing national situation. I mean, you have a man who proclaims that he is going to win all the time, a man who belittles and demeans people who disagree with him, who has no tolerance for divergent points of view, who's impulsive, vengeful, lacks empathy, doesn't seem to be able to reflect upon alternatives, and doesn't seem to be able to learn from the mistakes that arise from that. So he presents an overly confident, overly powerful demeanor, and some people, particularly people who have not necessarily studied psychology in depth, or who are just yearning for a powerful ally who will redeem them and stand up for them, and seems to be unquestionably successful in one domain, and proclaims expertise, power, and authority in domains where he has no demonstrable competence, that would be very appealing and seductive, and may have drawn many people to him, and those people have their wishes and hopes invested in a man who is, in my view, engaged in fooling himself about his insecurities that are presented in a very boastful, proud, posturing fashion that those of us with psychiatric and psychological training look at, and we see the likelihood of profound insecurity and self-doubt, which is the opposite of what's presented, and yet it can draw people in if they so desperately want a powerful leader to reverse their fortunes and ally themselves with him and be taken in that fashion.
Well, you also put your finger on what I think is one of the contradictions of the way the Goldwater Rule has been described. One is that we have this powerful expertise that we shouldn't be misusing in the making pronouncements about public figures. And the opposite argument has also been mounted. All this is so obvious. Who needs a psychiatrist to point out that this person is boastful and disagreeable and aggressive, etc.? But I think you were making a good case for the fact that, yes, all of our training and our experience is worth something, that it does give us a window of insight into the mental functioning of this person that a layman may not have. Maybe you could say more about that.
Sure. Well, you make a good point, and of course I'm in agreement with it. I think the gist of it is there's a sense that a man who cannot be taken at face value, and when people begin to have doubts, when he starts to stumble and contradict himself from one day to the next and deny that he had said the thing the previous day and blame the generals and blame the press. And for someone who's supposed to be so powerful to be constantly whining about how he's being victimized, and people are confused by that, and understandably they want to believe, and it's in all of our interests to have the most competent and the most clear-sighted leader that we can have, but someone who boasts and postures and exaggerates and deceives and won't take responsibility for his mistakes, that is confusing and conflicts with the idea that he is who he says he is. And I think you hit on an important irony, the flip side of which is if the American Psychiatric Association is so protective of its reputation, but then says that psychiatrists can't enter the discussion and fulfill another explicit ethical obligation of physicians to share knowledge with the public and help inform people's understanding of complicated matters, it's just self-defeating to, on the one hand, say that we need to be protected, and on the other hand, to assert that our expertise has no place in a public discourse where psychologically complicated and confusing material is presented to the public every day, and we have to rely on people without psychological training to make sense of it when we have a battery of people with so much experience and expertise and the capacity to help make sense out of what seems terribly confusing and far from obvious, except to people who have either studied this or have enough understanding of the seeming paradox of profound self-doubt presenting as overconfidence and enormous strength and certainty. These are uncertain times. He's faced with crises. If he won't listen to contrary points of view, but just attack people who differ with his preferred point of view, we don't have a reliable, predictable, strong, wise leader. We have a man of enormous impulsivity, poor judgment, self-delusion, with his hands on the nuclear codes and the other levers of power in the most powerful country on earth.
No, I think that's very well put. You really are articulating the danger very well and the role that we could or should be playing. As a psychoanalyst, I think you'll appreciate this. We know that oftentimes we bring about the very thing we fear, right? That's a psychoanalytic principle, right? If you have this fear of something, you bring it about. I think the American Psychiatric Association is bringing about the very thing it fears, that if they're afraid of being diminished or embarrassed, couldn't we argue that they're diminishing themselves by saying they have nothing to offer the world in terms of this discourse about understanding what our world leaders are doing? And also, if they're concerned about being ethically diminished, in some ways we could liken their behavior to the behavior of the German Psychiatric Association in the 1930s, who said nothing about the rise of Hitler. And history is not offering any praise to the German Psychiatric Association of the 1930s. In fact, they're lumped in with the Pope Pius and other people who we would have expected would have had some moral standing and some insight and would have stepped forward to speak up. So in some ways, I think you could make the argument, or I'll ask you if you want to make the argument or how you would put it, that in some ways the APA is actually doing the opposite of what it's trying to accomplish, that it's diminishing itself in a way, or diminishing the profession.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and it's ironic that in the name of shielding the profession from disgracing itself, it's cloistering its members and forbidding them to speak. It's possible that the American Psychiatric Association not only is concerned about the Goldwater fiasco from the 60s and 70s, but also the problems with Soviet psychiatry, where psychiatry became a tool of oppression and was used in a malignant way. And that's a legitimate concern. I don't think that the risk here is comparable. I think we have a vibrant press, and we have a judicial system. And within the judicial system, frequently psychiatrists and psychologists are called in to shed light for the judge and for the jury on things that they don't deal with every day and they don't so readily understand. And yes, there are sometimes conflicting experts on different sides, and that tends to diminish the appearance of expertise. But I think if you have faith in the sophistication and self-restraint and self-awareness of members who deal with their own feelings that get stirred up in doing their daily work and who are trained to deal with those feelings, then you allow them the dignity to speak up. In reality, the American Psychiatric Association is doing the opposite of protecting itself. It's cloistering and stifling its members, gagging them for fear that they will disgrace themselves. If I could offer an example of John, if the quarterback of a famous football team sustained an injury in a game thousands of miles away from where he customarily played, and an orthopedist appeared on the evening news and was asked to comment on the likely extent of the injury. That is such a commonplace that ordinarily the orthopedist doesn't even say, well, of course you understand I haven't examined him and I haven't looked at the x-ray studies and so forth. That's sort of understood. Wouldn't hurt to say that, but it's become such a commonplace that it's understood. Nobody would think, oh my God, the reputation of the American Orthopedic Society is in tatters because this person offered an opinion. That opinion that is offered isn't a clinical opinion that's then going to be used for a treatment plan. No, it's the doctors at the bedside who have examined the patient and have looked at the x-ray studies who will make that kind of professional opinion. But the opinion of a professional to inform and enlighten the public, that's applicable whether you're talking about quarterback's ankle or a menu for a large gathering of friends, or who ought to lead the American Kennel Association. I mean, it's not a clinical opinion, and it's generally understood that you're hearing from an investment expert, a caterer, or someone else, not someone who has taken medical, psychological responsibility for the care of a person. Donald Trump is not our patient. He is our president. And as the president, we have a responsibility to add our expertise to the discussion. If he were our patient, we would have to conduct ourselves in accord with the Goldwater Rule and the other ethical constraints in our discipline. But he isn't our patient. He's our president. And if we're silent, we are complicit with whatever happens that could have been modified or prevented if we found voice for our convictions.
Well, that's very powerfully put. And, you make a good point. This is aberrant and different from every other profession, right? Legal experts, there's talking heads on MSNBC and what have you who are giving legal opinions. They're not saying Donald Trump's not my client. I haven't had a conference with him. They're giving an opinion about the law. And yet there's been a vacuum in the discussion of Donald Trump's mental health. If you want to hear about Donald Trump's mental health, you got to watch Morning Joe, as I did yesterday. And they came up with 12 synonyms for crazy yesterday on Morning Joe. He's unhinged. He's not well. He's crazy. He's, but they're all colloquial terms for mentally ill being offered by people who, of course, would admit they're not qualified. So what we've created is a situation where only the unqualified are allowed to render a professional opinion.
Right. Excuse me for interrupting, but
that's right.
It's true. I mean, in the past, the Goldwater Rule served to prevent unwarranted speculation about the unobservable inner life of a person. Now, the American Psychiatric Association, by extending the Goldwater Rule, has made it impossible for psychiatrists to comment on the readily observable, universally available, and extensively provided by his hunger for publicity and attention over decades of Donald Trump. You can't comment on what everybody else can see. And as you point out, everyone else feels free to comment without license and also without the expertise, experience, training, and the presumed self-restraint that comes with professional training.
Right. So it really is an ironic situation. Actually, you put your finger on another aspect of the Goldwater Rule that I think is intellectually and clinically indefensible, never mind morally or ethically, which is that during the original debacle with Goldwater, it was pre-DSM. And so the kind of speculative comments that the psychiatrists were making were, forgive me, but psychoanalytic speculations that do infer a certain internal process that we have to be witness to in a clinical situation, so that he was scarred by his potty training, one analyst wrote, or he was fixated at the Oedipal stage. Well, these are obviously constructs which some people believe exist, some people don't, but in either case are not observable through behavior. They're observable in the office where you hear the free associations of the client, etc.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say that they're observable. It's possible to infer them.
They're inferable.
From clinical information.
Right.
We can't go back to potty training, and we certainly, as you're getting to, we don't rely on those kinds of suppositions and theoretical formulations when we have much more concrete, observable, and valid demonstrations of patterns of behavior that, when put together, particularly by an experienced observer, are recognizable as a personality style, a character formation, and that is relatively durable over the course of time. it's very difficult to change that, even with expert treatment. It's easy to diagnose it when you see someone who demonstrates a pattern of repeated behavior of a particular time in a constellation that we've seen so many times in our office. And this, I think, is an important addition, which we know leads to predictable repetitions of that behavior with compromised capacity to deal appropriately and accurately with the reality that they're around. They're preoccupied with self-preservation and self-inflation, and they can't take alternative views of a situation and say, well, maybe I got that wrong initially, and what so-and-so is telling me is demonstrably true, and I need to eat some humble pie and acknowledge I've made mistakes and go about that particular issue differently and others in the future differently, because I recognize that I'm not the inevitable winner that I have advertised myself to be. I pull my pants on one leg at a time like everybody else, and so I've got to make the best of the most expert minds that I have around, draw on them, and then reflect on the information and come up with sound and reliable judgments that are my best call. They're still not guaranteed, but they are informed, and they're not an impulsive reaction to something that irks him and that he feels he must destroy in order to regain his sense of composure and self-worth.
Yes, and just to put a fine, you express the danger very well, but just to put a fine point on the DSM issue, because I think a lot of...
I'm losing the audio here, John.
You're losing the audio?
Now, okay, keep going.
Okay.
I've got it.
That what a lot of people don't understand, and our mutual colleague Bob Spitzer, who started the DSM, will be the first to tell you that his aim in starting the DSM was to develop operational, observable diagnostic criteria for every disorder so that we didn't have to use inferred concepts that might be theoretically specific to one orientation, but that these would be observable behaviors. So, for example, in asking, does Donald Trump show signs of antisocial personality disorder? Well, what
I'm sorry, John. John, you're coming in and out on the audio, and I've got it pumped up as far as I can, and then I don't know what it is, but...
Can you hear me a little better now if I turn my mic up?
Definitely can, yes.
Okay, let me do that. Sorry about that. So in asking, is Donald Trump potentially antisocial, what are the diagnostic criteria? Lying. That's one of the main criteria. Well, we have it documented by the Washington Post and Politico and PolitiFact that this is the most prodigious liar, perhaps, and he won the Guinness Book of World Records for lying. He lies every 3 minutes and 15 seconds. So this is observable behavior. It's verifiable behavior. And so I've had to answer this question so many times in interviews. How can you know? How can you really know? I don't know, because it's a documented fact. That's how I know. I know he's a liar because it's been documented. And people don't appreciate that with the DSM, we have these clear behavioral criteria. Does he have a pattern of exploiting others and violating the rights of others? Well, I think if you're a serial sexual assaulter, then you have a pattern of violating the rights of others. If you don't pay your workmen, you have a pattern of violating the rights of others. This isn't subtle X-rays that we're interpreting here. This is a very gross signs of behavior that are very observable and verifiable. And I think people don't understand that about diagnosis in the 21st century.
Right. Okay. So you and I may have a bit of a difference here, because while I'm not in disagreement with any of your observations, I would refrain from taking them to a specific diagnosis. And I would do that for two reasons. First of all, I do believe that diagnosing requires a higher degree of certainty than the recognition of impairment. Somebody said, if you see somebody coughing, hacking, and sneezing, they're sick. You may not know whether they have pneumonia or emphysema. So just to use a gross example. The second reason is more strategic than scientific, and that's that I think we get ourselves into hot water and become more vulnerable to criticism and accusations of psychiatric name calling when we put specific labels on. And so if one person says sociopathy and the other person says paranoid personality and the third person says this is a clear narcissistic personality disorder, I think that confuses the central conclusion that the man is psychologically impaired and unfit to serve as president. Which particular diagnosis one would put one's money on and what is the best treatment for that? None of those, by the way, are particularly susceptible to psychiatric intervention. I think we're on firmer ground if we are more modest and delimited in our conclusions, and we state the degree of his impairment, the repetitive and predictive nature of his impairment, and we leave the diagnoses, in my preferred view, to the people who actually might attempt to treat him were he wise enough to seek the treatment that could be of some help, at least to alerting him to what the pitfalls are that he continually falls into.
No, I totally understand and respect your position. I do just want to jump in, though, and say that I think it's actually all of the above. You mentioned 3 diagnoses in your differential diagnosis, and I think as a malignant narcissist, which is what I have labeled him as, malignant narcissism involves narcissism, antisocial, and paranoid personality disorder. So it's the triple crown of personality disorders. He meets all 3 criteria, is what I would argue, but I understand where you're coming from. Let me ask the question a different way then. What is it about, I mean, you've already addressed this to a great extent, but what is it then about him that makes him dangerous, that you feel this need to warn the public and to take this very controversial position?
Well, I think I have addressed it, but let me try to do it in a more encapsulated way. In order to be an effective leader of the most powerful country in the world, one has to realize that one's task is enormous and exceeds one's gut understanding of things, that one has to rely on people who've spent their lives studying particular areas of foreign relations or economics or labor law, and rely on good people. And I think, honestly, that was the belief that many of the people who voted for him had, is that, yeah, he's kind of talking through his hat, but he'll have good people and he'll rely on them. Well, you know, he had a person of integrity in James Comey, and we saw how he handled that. And he doesn't leave himself open to learning new information in a way that doesn't force that information to fit into the Procrustean bed of what he already knows, quote unquote, knows and believes in his gut. And since, you know, as Barack Obama said, only the hard things get to the president. The simple things are decided at the level of cabinet levels or assistant secretaries. But the really challenging, complex, and uncertain issues rise to the president to make decisions. When a man is ill-tempered, impatient, vindictive, intolerant of diverse opinions, and relying on his gut over the experience, knowledge, and sophisticated understandings that have been accrued by professionals over decades of study and work, then you have a very reckless and unpredictable man with his hands on the levers of power. And what could come out of that is really terrifying if you allow yourself to recognize just how uncertain and unreliable a leader we have.
What are some of the outcomes that you fear?
Well, I'm afraid that the temptation to arouse public unity around a rash international decision, such as attacking a provocative country like North Korea, just to pick one out. That's a sort of time-honored political maneuver of desperate authoritarians, is to stimulate heightened nationalism by attacking an outsider. And if you can do that and be a winner by bombing the hell out of them, that could be appealing if his poll numbers dropped, even further, and if people began to flee his side because they felt he was so easily corrupted and so impaired and defective in his thinking that they didn't want to be associated with him. If they were leaving a sinking ship, he might feel impelled to do something internationally that was desperate and would summon the country to unite behind him. What else might he do? Well, you referenced his apparent license that he feels to abuse women and their rights. You didn't mention his brutal insensitivity towards disabled people, his terribly biased and hateful attitude towards Muslims or Mexicans. I mean, these populations are all vulnerable to the abusive use of state power. And we have seen that, and we've seen the intention to expand that. These people are also our colleagues and our friends and our sisters and children. They're American citizens. They're entitled to be treated with respect and a presumption of their worthiness, and not a presumption of their being contemptible and abuse-worthy. I worry about what he has already started to do in attacking minority populations. And I think about what has happened historically when minority populations get scapegoated and blamed for things that they don't have any control over, but makes them convenient targets to get the scrutiny and criticism off of the person who actually does have power to be helpful to people and to act in their self-interest, but who seems to be primarily intoxicated with and driven to exalt himself. That's scary to me.
There's a demonization, is the word I would use, for scapegoating of vulnerable minorities. And one of the groups that you didn't mention is illegal immigrants, who make up 13 million members of our community. And of course, we are a nation of immigrants. I wrote a book, The Hypomanic Edge, about how it is the energy and the risk tolerance and the get up and go of immigrants that made this country, that they have those genes, and that's part of our strength. It's one of our, we know economically immigrants actually stimulate the economy. But yet you have the feeling that if Donald Trump had no restraint, he would be rounding these people up, knocking on their doors, dragging them out of their homes, dragging them out of their offices, taking them to camps. I mean, we don't know how far he would go if he weren't restrained by other factors in society, and how much he will be restrained.
Right. I think we don't know, and it is frightening, and it's something that we can begin to see taking shape with a travel ban and the illegality of it and the demeaning of the judicial system and the intolerance for divergence. I mean, what you're talking about in a way is how we are strengthened by the multiplicity of views and backgrounds and perspectives that have enriched our country and informed our diets and our understanding of the world around us. And if you want to be isolative and demeaning of people with different backgrounds, not only are you impoverishing your understanding, but you're weakening the country because you're not accessing the strength, vitality, enthusiasm, and the joy that people who have come from places without our traditional liberties and come here seeking that and exult in it and flourish in it. Well, you know, you're essentially weakening the country that you claim to be trying to make great again.
And, you know, you mentioned Soviet psychiatry. The difference between the Soviet abuse of psychiatry and what we're trying to do is that the Soviets were using the power of the state. The state
Right.
was using psychiatry as an excuse to oppress people or to silence people or imprison people who were dissenting. And yet part of the concern that you're expressing is exactly that power of the state to impose on people who are vulnerable. So it's really the opposite of what we're talking about. We're talking about protecting people from abuses by the state, and that's the opposite of Soviet psychiatry.
Well, that's quite right. It is the opposite. And, you know, while I don't want to overstate the case, I think you made the point well earlier that enforcing silence from people who are calling out obvious impairment in leadership winds up making the profession, to the extent that people are going to be bound by that gag rule, silently complicit in whatever happens. And that is quite the opposite of what we would have hoped the Russian psychiatrists or the German psychiatrists, and what we hope now that the American psychiatrists and American psychologists and mental health professionals more broadly will do. That is the opposite of the shameful, either active, complicit behavior with the Soviet government or the silent, complicit behavior of German psychiatrists.
Well, I'm very grateful, Dr. Glass, that you have not been silent. And despite your...
I'm grateful to your activism, John.
And despite your very, very impressive credentials, I think quitting the APA is the line that I'm the most impressed with.
I'm sorry, I missed the very last part of what you said.
Sorry, I'll repeat it. I said, despite your very impressive list of credentials, the item on the list I'm most impressed with is you're quitting the APA.
Well, I wish I didn't have to, but I'm glad that having to, that I did it, and I hope that others will learn from it, and maybe the APA will make it possible for people that they have gagged to speak out and possibly even join the broader community of mental health professionals in identifying the problem that we're all grappling with, whether or not we give voice to it. Thanks, John.
Thank you, and you've really led the way, and I'm very appreciative. Thank you for coming on today and talking to me.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.